Good day, everyone. I'm Tyrone, keep the address, a current second-year student from the University of the Philippines Diliman Asian Center, and I'm honored and privileged to present to you today my paper entitled Linking Labor Policy and Development, a critique of Japanese labor policies since the post-bubble era. We are aware that Japan possesses one of the world's most notorious and intensive work cultures. However, are Japanese workers really overworked? A 2020 data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says otherwise. A Japanese worker had an annual average work hours of 1,598 hours per year, lower compared to the OECD member states average of 1,687 hours per year, and even lower compared to that of South Korea's 1,908 hours per year. Considering these, despite Japan lying around the middle or median of developed states in terms of annual average work hours, how did they still manage to foment or create such a work culture that effectuates harm to its workers? We can attribute two variables to this. First is an entrenched work culture, and second, the 1990s bubble burst of Japan's economy. An asset bubble in the 1980s skyrocketed Japan's economy and raised prices of assets such as land and property. However, by the early 1990s, a combination of numerous factors such as an unpredictable market, yen currency appreciation, untimely decisions made by the Ministry of Finance and Bank of Japan when to expand or when to contract their monetary policies, bank deregulation, among others, caused an economic crash which eventually led to a long recession and currently a still sluggish economic growth for Japan. However, the bubble burst's long-standing effect in the labor force is a greater mobility in the employment pool, where businesses and institutions opted for more flexible employment arrangements, such as contractual and part-time workers, and a decline in the lifetime employment system, which is a pervasive characteristic of Japanese work culture. How can we characterize Japanese work culture? We can say that there are some aspects that we can consider. First and foremost, which is the concept of yarikata, or this is the way we do things here in the company. There's also the concept of corporate hierarchy, where you must know your place in the company, and where if you are in a subservient position, you must serve the interest and you must serve your superiors with the best of your abilities. There's also an emphasis to respect, being predictable, creating a structure, being attentive to detail, being appropriate when it comes to timing, and being exact when you are finishing your dues or deliverables. However, the darker side of Japanese work culture includes its infamous long working hours and overtime, and even during periods of low productivity, you are still expected to become productive through the accomplishment of menial tasks. A confluence of all of these characteristics induces pressure to a Japanese worker, which gave rise to a concerning phenomenon, the karōshi, or death by overwork, or worse, karōjisatsu, or suicide due to overwork. The intentions of this research is to find solutions to the following problems. First, just how efficacious are the efforts of the Japanese government to alleviate a notorious work culture after the 1990s burst? Second, what appropriate strategies can Japan partake to both ensure economic and social development? How can they make sure that they can keep afloat a stagnant economy while also ensuring the well-being of their citizens? And third, what is Japan's expected trajectory in terms of its labor landscape going towards the future? The research utilizes two theories, which together creates the framework for the study. We shall first tackle Midgley and MacPherson's theory of developmental social policy, which aims to perceive economic and social development as an input factor of the other. It aims to be a balanced, eclectic, and pragmatic model of social policy, which aims to emphasize that economic and social development need not be a compromise or a trade-off, where you must sacrifice economic development for social development or vice versa. Instead, we must create policies that must drive both economic and social policy. For example, a comprehensive social policy must be created to a point where it must also promote economic growth. And vice versa, a comprehensive economic policy must also be created to an extent where social development is also promoted. On the other hand, Jacobs and Asokan's comprehensive theory of social development emphasizes that development is not merely an outcome, but it is a process, and that development entails newer, more complex, and more intricate additions to existing or extant systems, which they term as a social fabric in the literature. So if society decides, for example, to implement changes or to move forward to a more progressive future, then changes must be implemented in their existing organizations or systems. And it must come from society's willingness for collective action and, of course, their aspiration for development. However, these changes are not shallow nor superficial. It must characterize deeply rooted changes in the form, attitudes, or behaviors of society, which is a difficult endeavor. For example, what if we need to pursue a more progressive policy? Then we must perhaps think about abolishing former traits or cultures, which is not easy to do. But if this is a procedure that a society must partake to ensure progress in the future, then they must have the willingness and the inclination to do so. Hence, if we are to synthesize both theories, we can determine that economic and social development must be pursued as analogous endeavors and not as a dichotomy where one must be sacrificed or compromised to achieve the other. It is indeed possible to pursue both of them without perceiving them as a trade-off, and this can be possible through first, creation of policies which must both tap economic and social enterprises, and second, society's awareness of the fact that they need to adjust to their existing systems, or rather they need to adjust their existing systems, such as their cultures or norms, to make it happen. We shall now proceed with a brief overview of government labor policies enacted after the 1990s bubble burst, beginning with Japan's labor standards law, first enacted 1947 and has made revisions ever since. This is what we can consider as a primary anchor of Japanese labor law. This provides a template, rather, for enacting labor regulations and how to settle labor disputes. It also provides guidelines for terms for employment, what is allowed time frame for work, provisions for overtime hours, rest periods, overnight payment, paid vacations, sick leaves, illnesses or injuries during work time, guidelines for compensation for death or accidents in the workplace, and of course the most important, enshrining of workers' rights, such as their rights or their freedom of contract, how they can fight for fairer TOAs or terms of agreements, how they can address wage concerns, and of course empowering them to create unions to protect the vested interests of the laborers or workers. However, there are certain caveats of the Japanese labor standards law which we must consider. First of which is the issue of regulatory autonomy. Businesses and companies are given a huge amount of autonomy despite the presence of laws and policies. This can result in them interpreting the laws and policies according to their own discretion and might not necessarily be of benefit to the workers. Since the companies or the businesses are given the autonomy to manage their own labor forces, then the Japanese labor standards law merely act as a framework concerning industrial relations with no firm regulatory or supervising provisions which will allow the government to truly intervene when necessary. In addition, there is a problem towards the labor law enforcers' disposition towards non-intervention, where they would rather let the corporation settle internal disputes or supervise internal affairs, such as the recruitment or disciplining of workers. There's also the problem with the law's working hour limits. There have been two amendments made in 1987 and 1992 to try to lower the working hour limits, first implemented in 1947. But we have to remember that despite these amendments, the provisions indicated in the law act more as a recommendation than an enforcing policy. There's also the problem of legal binding powers when agreements are being made. When agreements are already consented upon or have been both signed by both parties, it makes it harder for workers to negotiate for fairer and more humane working terms. And of course, we have to also problematize the frailty of unions, because unions are usually the ones that face companies when they try to negotiate for better working terms. However, at the end of the day, unions usually bend to the proclivity or to the disposition of companies despite them fighting for their labor rights. And of course, an ever entrenched culture of company loyalty and subservience. However, there are also other policies or laws implemented in the sector of physical or psychological illness, karōshi and karōjisatsu, such as a comprehensive program for the prevention of health impairment due to overwork, enacted in 2002, which obligates employers to provide needed medical intervention and interview guidance to their workers on a regular basis. There's also the ISHA, or the Industrial Safety and Health Act, first enacted in 1972 and amended in 2005, which obligates employers to create a safe and healthy working environment for their workers. There's also the Karoshi Prevention Countermeasures Promotion Law in 2014, which obligates the government to do the following. First, to research and disseminate information about the karōshi phenomenon to the public. Second, to create guidelines to prevent karōshi incidences from happening in the future. And third, compensating families of karōshi victims. Also, there is an initiative in 2015 by the Abe Cabinet to combat karōshi through discharging investigative and preventive mechanisms to combat karōshi in the workplace. Despite the overwhelming amount of labor laws and policies which aims to protect and to ensure the rights of Japanese workers, we must face this very difficult question: how effective are they? According to Friedman 1969, we must consider first a complex relationship between the efficacy of laws and the culture of a society. A created law which matches the culture of a society tends to have higher efficacy, but created laws which does not correspond to the culture of a society tend to have a lower level of efficacy. In Japan's experience, despite the presence of such labors and laws, it has been proven and observed that such labor laws and policies remain ineffective. Efficacy is dismal if not nil, because first and foremost, these laws and policies does not correspond to an entrenched Japanese work culture. And second, Japan does not really have an incentive to truly modify their current work culture, despite presence of labor laws and policies, simply because their work culture enabled them to become a successful economic powerhouse after the US occupation during the 1940s. Afterwards, their economy began to skyrocket and they became one of the world's largest economy up until today. So we are now faced with the difficult dilemma: just how willing is Japan to modify or to alter certain aspects of their work culture in order to pave the way for a more progressive labor culture? We may never know the answer to that question as of today. About what can Japan do? Japan can implement radical changes, not just band-aid changes, but radical, long-lasting, sustainable, potent changes rooted from crafting holistic developmental policies. And they must also come to a consensus, to a recognition that there must be changes in Japan's existing organizations, cultures, and norms before such labor laws and policies are effective. And these changes did not happen immediately, but it can be implemented sparingly. For example, initiating changes in policymaking, initiating changes in the education sector, initiating changes in the family culture, in the community or neighborhood culture, and other cultural institutions, which can help enlighten the Japanese public that there need not be a compromise or trade-off between economic and social development. What is Japan's trajectory towards the future? It will be determined by Japan's commitment to altering its current systems to accommodate a more progressive working culture. It is yet to be seen how willing they are to pursue such changes. And we can also attempt to question, how did the COVID-19 pandemic, if any, make any impact or changes in Japanese labor laws, policies, and implementation? In conclusion, in order to synthesize everything that we have talked about this morning, an entrenched work culture, loopholes, weak implementation, and pressures to sustain a stagnating economy render Japanese labor laws and policies quite ineffective. And this is a losing situation for Japanese workers because they are more burdened than ever to commit to such a system which harms them to begin with. And for Japan to have a more progressive labor standing, it must be committed to creating developmental policies while recognizing the importance of altering its current systems despite its difficulties. It is indeed a difficult endeavor, but for changes to occur and for Japan to have a more positive labor standing in terms of the international community, then they must be committed to these changes, despite how excruciating it may be. That's all for my talk for today. Thank you for listening. Kiite korete arigatou gozaimasu. If you have any more questions or inquiries that you would like to address to me, I'll be more than willing to answer them. Once again, thank you for listening and have a great day ahead.